Hello, and thank you for joining me. I am Travis Watson, the Bee Man, and today we're going to be taking a look at the HoneyBee Pail Heater and Insulator. And Brisk Heat saw the old pail heater review that I did, and so they decided to send me out this new product to take a look at it and tell you guys what I thought, and so that's what we're going to do in today's video. Now, the old pail heater that I had, it was just the Brisk Heat pail heater. It went up to 160, 165 degrees. I don't remember off the top of my head. And they've updated the model. This one's sold by HoneyBee. I believe that is owned by Brisk Heat. And this one goes up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit or 71 degrees Celsius if you're outside of the United States. And what makes it unique is that it is 550 watts. That is a higher powered device. Draws about 3 amps, so you don't have to worry about blowing your outlets or anything like that, or blowing your breakers. But it heats up much faster, and it supposedly should reduce the amount of time that it takes to decrystallize honey. Of course, anyone who has more than a couple of hives knows the benefit of storing your honey in these 5-gallon pails. That way you don't have to keep, several hundred bottles of honey handy. And if you're keeping your honey in bottles, of course any honey crystallizes over time. Then you have to sort of boil it in order to decrystallize, and it's hard to control the water temperature whenever you're boiling. You can very easily overheat the honey and caramelize it. Very, very easily make it so it's not raw anymore if you heat it up too much. And that's sort of the benefit here of having a pail heater, which is fairly temperature controlled. This one isn't completely temperature controlled. They're supposedly working on a product with a specific thermostat. That way you can control down to the degree what your pail heater is going to be at. But the nice thing with it being 160 degrees, you may not be raw at that temperature anymore. But 160 degrees is never going to caramelize your honey. So going from raw to the pasteurized level doesn't really affect the flavor. What affects the flavor is when you get it up toward closer to boiling, where you're getting it up close to 200 degrees. I think it might be 190 degrees where it caramelizes. I actually don't know that. I'm sure someone will correct me in the comment section. They always do. But moral of the story is this pail heater, it keeps the honey below a temperature where it will caramelize. And that really preserves the flavor and integrity of your honey. The nice thing about it is you don't have to run it all the way up at 160 degrees, so that's good for beekeepers like myself who sell locally, because local honey, if you keep it raw, it has your local pollens in it. Of course, your larger beekeepers who sell nationwide, that doesn't really matter because your plants are different over state line or across states and stuff like that. So if you're a commercial keeper that sells nationwide, crank it up to 160 degrees, forget about it, wait, come back in a few hours when it's decrystallized. If you're local, then you might want to turn it up maybe halfway, 3/4 of the way, and then stir it every couple of hours. That way you don't get any hot pockets within the pail of honey. And that will give you a lot more control to be able to keep it down in the raw range and still be able to have the benefits of local honey and keeping those pollens intact. So one of the chief benefits of this new system is Brisk Heat or HoneyBee, they give you, or I got an insulator, it's just called an insulator. And what it does is it mimics an insulating blanket. So whenever you are looking at reheating honey, you have your cabinets for the big commercial guys. Those are several $1,000s. You have your blankets, which is basically a heated blanket that goes all the way around the pail with elements all throughout. And then you have your band heaters. And these are sort of the cheaper options, but they are very localized in the heat that they put out, and that can create hot pockets within the pail. The nice thing about having an insulator that goes around your band heater is it sort of gets you the benefits of the band, which decrystallizes the honey more quickly than an overall blanket, but it also spreads that heat out over the entirety of the pail, and that really should drastically reduce the amount of time it takes to decrystallize an entire pail. So on the last video where I was only working with a band heater, it took about 36 hours for the honey to fully decrystallize out of the 5-gallon pail. Of course, that's a lot of honey in there, and it can take a while if you're leaving it at that lower temperature in order to keep it raw, like I do. And so we're going to see today, it's around noon on March 1st here, so we're going to see how long it takes us to fully decrystallize this honey. I'm going to turn this up about 3/4 of the way. Of course, the nice thing about this heater is that you have a nice clear dial, and it has a temperature, it has the 0 marking at the bottom, and then of course you can turn the dial up or down based on that 0 marking. And so I'm going to turn it about 3/4 of the way up, and within a minute or so you can already feel it starting to heat up. That is the chief benefit of having the 550 watts. It's a very fast heat up time. And then we're going to take the blanket, the insulator, and put it around that. And so we're going to see how it goes. Of course, if you take a look at the actual honey, this honey was harvested in 2019. We're right now March 1st, 2021. So it's a little over a year and a half old, right around a year and a half old, and it is crystallized solid. So this should take quite a while to decrystallize. So it's not a true comparison because my other bucket wasn't quite as crystallized, but we're going to see for sure. And so you see with the band heaters, you want to set them around towards the bottom of the pail because that's where a lot of your crystallized honey collects. It generally floats down. Now this one's crystallized all the way up, but generally the crystallization, you'll see it starting at the bottom. Right now I have it turned all the way up. So I like to turn it all the way up and then back it off about 1/4 of the way, and you can already feel it heating up. Then all you do is you take your blanket, and the nice thing about this insulator is it has the cutout right here to go perfectly around the heater. And so you don't have to worry about fussing about, if you just do this at home, of course, or if you try your own insulators, you lose access to that dial, whereas this leaves that in place. It's very nice, and for a pretty affordable price here. And you have the snaps. All you do is snap it in place. Very simple system. And that's it. I mean, you just sort of set it and forget it. Come back and review it every couple of hours. That way you can stir it up, because like I said, I'm leaving this at a lower temperature so that way it can still be considered raw. And because of that, you want to stir it every few hours so you don't have any localized hot spots. Once it's decrystallized enough to be able to stir, of course. Right now, I wouldn't be able to get anything in there. But we'll take a look every few hours here, and we'll see how long it takes. Okay, we're going to do our first update here. We are 5.5 hours in. It is about 5:30 right now. And I want to correct a couple of things. I did a little bit more digging, and I saw that we are actually at 4.58 amps on this. I'd said, based on the wattage, I'd guessed it would pull about 3 or 4, but you're 4.58 amps. Still, most houses, you have 15 amp service or 20 amp service. So the amperage on this isn't really going to affect your electrical really much at all. So we're going to get into it here. One thing I found, I checked in at around the 2-hour mark, and I only had the dial turned up about halfway, and it wasn't really even hot to the touch. Something that I found is that on the dial, and we'll get it active and zoom in here. On the dial, really most of your adjustment is going to be in the maximum thing here. So I had to actually crank it up. I'm not at maximum temperature, but I've been touching it and feeling according to hand, getting behind the insulator and touching it by hand to make sure I'm not getting too hot. But most of your temperature adjustment is within this final selection here, and it drops off really rapidly below this final one, to the point where it's not much use on the lower parts here. So that's maybe one thing that I think could probably be improved on this device, is have a wider usable range instead of just having all of the usable range in this last little bit here. But that's really kind of a nitpick, because, you know, as long as you touch it with your hand, you can make sure that you're okay. Another thing, I need to make sure that I'm clear here. The reason why you put these heaters at the bottom of the pail is because you should not have them up above the liquid. You do not want it to be the hot on the plastic with nothing on the inside of it, because that can overheat the plastic and cause some problems. Since this pail is full, that's not as much of a problem for me, but if you only have a half of a pail that needs decrystallized, that may be a problem for you. So taking a look on the inside here, there's my stirring spoon. You can see we're still pretty crystallized. you can actually smell. You can't smell it over the camera, of course, but along the edges, you know, we are getting a little bit softer here. So there is something happening, and you can certainly smell that something is happening. But you know, 5 hours in on a pail that has been crystallized for a couple of years, you're not going to decrystallize it in 5 hours. This is still going to be a multi-day thing. So we're going to give it the rest of the evening here. I'll probably call it quits around 10 o'clock. We'll see how we're looking, and then I'll probably check back in later. Okay, so we're just wrapping up here for the first night. It is about 10 o'clock, so this has been on for about 10 hours. We're starting to see quite a bit of softening. Take a look at that. Now, you're always going to have that crust at the top there. But you can see where I dug down a little bit where it's getting really dark and nice and soft. So it does look like we're having some decent progress here. Whereas before it took about 36 hours before. We're 10 hours in now. Mind you, that first 2 hours was hardly anything because I didn't really have the heat on. And even now, it's not that hot right now. I really could probably turn it up quite a bit more than it is now. It's not going to be a perfect comparison because we don't know temperature to temperature. So I think we'll probably come back tomorrow. When the honey's this crystallized, you can really just crank it up all the way. Because as it's crystallized, you're not gonna get up above raw until you have a lot more melting. So probably in the future, I'm going to just start it off all the way up and then crank it back as it starts to melt down and decrystallize a little bit more. But we're going to get started back again in the morning, and we'll kind of see how it goes here. Okay, we're now on the next day here. I have flipped the pail heater upside down here. That way it goes on the top of the pail up here. Now, I'm only doing that, and pay attention so no one does this and catches their house on fire. I'm only doing that because this is a full pail. You are not supposed to put these heaters up above the liquid line, okay? This is well below the liquid line within this pail. That's why I'm doing it. Because it's all the way full, I'm moving that up and down in order to get the top melted down a little bit, so that way I can start stirring it and get it decrystallized a little quicker. If you want, you certainly can leave this on the bottom and just let it go right from the start. But that takes a little bit longer, and I did this on my last video, and since I'm trying to compare the pail heater with the insulator compared to the pail heater by itself, I wanted to do the same thing on this video that I did on that way I have a better comparison to what I did before. So taking a look at it, we've been going for about 3 hours now, and you can see we got liquid honey. So, and sticking the spoon down, we're liquid almost all the way down. So this is decrystallizing much quicker than the other one did. So that tells me that the insulator here is doing its job, and it is certainly speeding things along. It took me I was probably 20 hours into it before I got to this point before, whereas right now we're sitting right around 8 hours. So we have significantly cut down the amount of time it has taken us to decrystallize a good portion of that honey in there. And mind you, this is more crystallized than the honey was in that other video, because this has been sitting for a lot longer than that was. So early returns look good, and I will be checking this out as the day goes on. At some point, once this top gets melted down enough, I will switch the pail heater back down to the bottom where it's really supposed to go. So we'll check in here in a few hours and let you know how it's going. Okay, we got our final update here today. We're at about the 16-hour mark, and it's done. It's decrystallized. Now, there is still some stuff down in the bottom, and the reason for that, because I like to keep it raw, I don't get it up, the temperature up high enough to decrystallize all the stuff way, way down in the bottom. So if you're keeping your honey raw, you're going to still have some of that way down in the bottom, but as you can see, there's a couple of chunks just because I stirred it. But we are decrystallized. That looks pretty good. So took 36 hours without the insulator on it, and this one took about 16. So this insulator really cut down on the amount of time that it took. And the pail heater down here, I mean, that's, you know, it's just as good as any other pail heater. I do like how fast it heats up. You know, and apart from wishing that it had a more usable range on the dial there, I think it's a perfectly good option, and it's one that I would certainly consider buying myself here, especially if you can get it with the insulator. I think in the future I'll make sure that if I'm ever getting one, I'll probably get the insulator along with it, because that's a pretty good system. I'm pretty happy with that. So, you know, you'll see the description down below for HoneyBee, for the Honey Warmer at Temperature Superstore. And you know, feel free to reach out to them if you have any issues, and enjoy your honey.